In this lecture, we will look at the monumental architecture of Teotihuacan and how it is related to the creation and maintenance of political power. In the foreground, we see the sculpted head of a horned feathered serpent on the feathered serpent pyramid at the southern end of the Avenue of the Dead. And in the distance, you see the Pyramid of the Sun, the largest structure built in the Americas before the arrival of the Spanish. The sacred center of Teotihuacan is oriented along the Avenue of the Dead. At the northern end of the Avenue of the Dead is the Pyramid of the Moon. About halfway down is the Pyramid of the Sun. And at the southern end, the Ciudadela, which contains the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent. Along the Avenue of the Dead are administrative buildings, other temples, and the residences of the ruling elite. Opposite the Ciudadela and the Pyramid of the Feathered Serpent at the southern end, you see another large open square, which is believed to have been the public market, where merchants and traders would come to exchange wares. The Pyramid of the Moon is at the very northern end of the Avenue of the Dead, and is at the north end of a large plaza surrounded by a series of smaller pyramids that supported temples or other administrative structures at their summits. In the middle left, we see a very ornate apartment complex known as the Palace of Quetzalcoatl, the Palace of the Feathered Butterfly, which we believe was an administrative center, the residence of one of the important ruling families of the city. The Pyramid of the Moon was built in 7 stages, each building on top of the previous stages, leading to a larger and grander structure with each successive phase of construction. The pyramid was a fairly small structure during the first 3 phases of construction, but began to expand considerably with the 4th, and then finally with the 6th and 7th reaching its final configuration. An excavation tunnel running along the north-south axis of the pyramid has been excavated and revealed several very interesting dedicatory burials. You can see how these burials were placed in different locations. Some, burials A, C, and D, were placed at the rear of an existing pyramid beneath the later fill. They were dedications that were done at the beginning of an episode of construction, whereas other burials, B and E, were placed in or near the summits of the pyramids and were thus done near the final phases of its construction. We will look closely at burial labeled A here, as well as talk some more about B, both associated with the 4th phase of construction around AD 220. Here's a plan view map of the burial as labeled A on the previous map. It was the dedication for the 4th construction stage around AD 220 and was placed at the rear of the previous construction phase and then covered with the construction of stage 4. Placed in the pit and facing towards the west, the direction of death, was a human sacrifice, with his arms bound behind his back. He was wearing greenstone ear spools, suggesting that he was of relatively high social status. The center and the 4 corners were marked with figurines made from obsidian as well as ceramic or other stone figurines. Jars called Tlaloc jars representing a particular deity associated with rain and agricultural abundance. Obsidian knives and golden eagles in each of the 4 corners. There were also serpents placed in the center, and offerings of pumas and a wolf, and they were placed in wooden cages. You can see the outlines of the remnants of the cages around the puma and the wolf, and we know that they were placed alive because in one of the puma cages was a puma coprolite. The puma had pooped in its cage prior to being entombed within. We believe that all of the sacrificial offerings were placed in here alive and then entombed beneath the pyramid. Pumas, wolves, golden eagles, falcons, owls, rattlesnakes, these are all powerful animals that represent certain concepts in Teotihuacan's thought and cosmology. Golden eagles continued to be very important symbolic animals in the later Aztec period, and the Aztec symbol of a golden eagle seated upon a cactus consuming a rattlesnake is still an important symbol in Mexico, and the central figure on its flag. Pumas are also very powerful animals. They are the top predator in that region, the only thing that could potentially challenge man within its domain. Recent research on the isotope ratios of the pumas and the wolves suggests that they ate a diet of animals that were fed primarily corn, and has been interpreted as suggesting that these were animals that were raised in captivity prior to their entombment as sacrifices for the construction of the Pyramid of the Moon. While these figurines are from different burials, they give you an idea of the types of figurines that were placed. On the left is one that is a wooden figurine covered in a mosaic of greenstone and jade, as well as coral and shell. In the lower left is a solid jade figurine with jade beads. There are also figurines that were shaped out of obsidian, which is a very important resource. Obsidian is found near the city of Teotihuacan, and Teotihuacan seems to have controlled the mining and the processing of obsidian into tools that were traded widely. The article from National Geographic described the excavations that the Institut Nacional Antropología y Historia in Mexico has been conducting underneath the Pyramid of the Moon. So it's very challenging to dig a tunnel underneath this massive pyramid with millions of tons of rock above. Mining engineers were brought in order to assure the safety of the archaeologists. In working in these confined quarters, the archaeologists had to have air pumped in to maintain enough oxygen to allow them to breathe, and worked in shifts so they wouldn't become overheated and claustrophobic. Here we see an archaeologist drawing a map of one of these burials that was found underneath the Pyramid of the Moon. Buried beneath millions of tons of rock, these burials were in some cases remarkably preserved because they had been protected from exposure to the elements and sealed within these tombs. Some of the details that were present was the evidence of binding of the arms behind some of the sacrificial victims' backs, and in some cases gags in order to keep them quiet during the performance of the ritual dedication. While the individuals in the lower dedicatory burials, those that were placed at the bottom, at the base of the previous construction and covered, there's lots of evidence of violence. However, in those that were placed in the summit, there's evidence that perhaps these were willing participants. They weren't bound. They weren't gagged. Indeed, some of them were seated in unusual positions that suggested they were of incredibly high status. While Burial 2, at the base of construction Phase 4, Burial 5, in its summit, had 3 individuals that were not bound or gagged. Rather, they were seated with their legs crossed in a position that is used in Mesoamerican art to indicate a god or a king. These individuals also do not seem to have been locals. One of them had these interesting dental features. The enamel had been incised to create holes within which inlays of jade were placed. It was like a prehistoric grill. Rather than platinum and diamonds, it was jade. And in other cases, these types of tooth mosaics were done in pyrite. Pyrite is a form of iron oxide that is sometimes referred to as fool's gold. This type of dental inlay was not a local practice. It was not found among the local populations in Teotihuacan. Rather, this is a practice that is found in the Mayan region. It is something that was only practiced by Mayan elites, individuals of the highest status, in order to indicate their position in society. So one of the three individuals buried in the summit of the pyramid at the end of construction stage 4 was seated cross-legged like a god or a king, had dental inlay that is found in the Maya region, not locally, and was used to indicate high status in that area. And he also was wearing this object about his neck. It is called a pectoral. You can see just above the thumb a hole that goes through the piece, and there is another one near the base of the thumb. Rope would be strung through this, and it would be held around the neck right above the pectoral muscles, hence its labeling as a pectoral. This object was carved from high-quality jade and has a symbol that was used to represent a portal to the underworld that shamans and kings had access to and used to communicate with the gods and with the ancestors. This individual was not treated rudely. He was buried with great respect, with high-value objects like this jade pectoral and jade ear spools. He was seated cross-legged like a god, and was dispatched in a very unusual manner as well. He had been stabbed between his shoulder blade, his left shoulder blade, and his spine with a jade perforator, a long knitting needle sort of object carved from jade and used during blood sacrifices used by kings and others to perforate a sensitive part of their body that we will discuss more in the Mayan lecture, in order to draw blood, in order to sacrifice it to the gods. So the evidence would seem to suggest that an individual of incredibly high status from the Maya region voluntarily was sacrificed in order to finalize the construction and completion and empowerment of this pyramid. Looking down from the Pyramid of the Moon along the Avenue of the Dead, you can see the Pyramid of the Sun on the left. And while these are about 600 meters apart, there's a decrease in the level of the ground. It goes downhill as you go along the Avenue of the Dead. And even though the Pyramid of the Sun is much larger than the Pyramid of the Moon in terms of its height, the tops of them are almost equal in level, which is a pretty amazing engineering feat. It would be quite an accomplishment for modern engineers using laser levels and modern surveying equipment, but it was accomplished by the prehistoric builders. The Pyramid of the Sun is the largest prehistoric structure in all of the Americas. The size of its base is almost identical to the base of the Great Pyramid of Khufu at Giza in Egypt, but that pyramid is much taller because it has much steeper angles that the slope of the pyramid rises to. And the Pyramid of the Sun, unlike the Great Pyramid, was intended to have a flat surface on top. As you can see, there are people going up the stairways to ascend to the top, where formerly a temple stood, and where the ruling elite of the community made sacrifices to the gods in order to maintain the balance of the cosmos. In the video, you will learn about some recent research using a technique called a muon detector in order to try to identify voids or tunnels or chambers that are beneath or within this pyramid. There have been some interesting results, and researchers are still following up on these. So in the future, there might be some very exciting discoveries coming from beneath the Pyramid of the Sun, like those that were discovered beneath the Pyramid of the Moon. At the southern end of the Avenue of the Dead is the Ciudadela, a large compound about a quarter mile across that enclosed a plaza that contained the feathered serpent pyramid. As you can see, the platforms that define this compound supported other structures, smaller temples and administrative structures, and then the plaza within could have held very large assemblies of the citizens gathered for ritual or political activities. The feathered serpent pyramid received its name for the decorations that are found along its face, carved relief sculptures of various deities and feathered serpents. Here is a detail showing on the right one of the feathered serpents projecting out from the wall. On the upper left you can see one of the tenon sculptures. You can see the long piece of stone that stuck backwards was used to hold the face out of the wall. You can tell by looking at the one above that has been dislodged and is resting on a step that the statue that is within the wall is a composite feature with other carved stones to create the frill of feathers about its neck. Below the one that's on the step is a representation of an unusual being. It's got a projecting snout, prominent nose, nostrils, googly eyes, big teeth, a sort of scaly skin, looks vaguely crocodilian, and has been identified as the storm god. It has some association with the later Aztec god Tlaloc, and may have been an ancestral form of this later deity. Tlaloc is associated with rains, winds, and the coming of the spring, the emergence of agricultural bounty. You can also see on the wall between the two heads a rattlesnake rattle and seashells. The whole composition around the entire structure was a series of alternating crocodilian storm gods and feathered serpents being intertwined by the feathered body of the serpent, which is bearing along its body marine shell, which associates it with the ocean and the waters of the world. In Teotihuacan cosmology, these two deities seem to have been instrumental in the creation of rain, which was necessary in order to allow agricultural bounty and success in the entire community. Here is a detail of one of the feathered serpent sculptures, and there are more than 360 individual sculptures projecting out from the pyramid. Some of this is an estimate because not the whole pyramid was as well preserved as the excavated face that was shown in the earlier slide. It was estimated that 360 or more of these statues projected out, and all are very standardized, nearly identical to one another, which suggests a very highly controlled production in workshops that had a great degree of supervisory control to maintain the standardized form and appearance of these sculptures that would be integrated into a larger structure. Archaeological evidence suggests that this feature was built very rapidly, likely within 5 years, and so all of the production was not by a single sculptor, allowing this standardization and complete replication of form, but rather there would have been multiple workshops of individual sculptors and their assistants working to a common template in order to create standardized forms that could be placed within the structure. This suggests a high degree of control of the production process. And high degrees of control and expressions of political power are found with the dedicatory burials that have been excavated associated with the initial construction of the feathered serpent pyramid. More than 100 individuals were buried in several graves that are oriented along the cardinal directions, north, south, east, and west faces of the pyramid. Here is an overview detail of a set of graves that are placed on either side of the east-west axis cutting through the pyramid, 13 on either side, a group of 9 and a group of 4. Another group of 9 and a group of 4. And as we'll see when we get to Mesoamerican calendars, that 13 is an important number in Mesoamerican ideas of time. Here is a detail of one of those groups of 9. These individuals, as you can see, all had their arms bound behind them. But they also have artifacts associated with them that suggest status as warriors or soldiers. There were many obsidian projectile points, which you can see up around their heads, as though they had spears or arrows with them. And then about their necks were these unusual necklaces that were made either with real or clay or shell human jaws and teeth. In the video, Josh Bernstein visits this restored grave in the museum and discusses the feature with Bill Sanders, an archaeologist who has been working in the Teotihuacan area for decades, and he describes some recent research using oxygen isotopes to look at the origins and life histories of these individuals, just like the research that Price and Manzanilla did on individuals in the immigrant barrios. While some of these soldiers appear to have been born in and lived their entire lives in Teotihuacan, several were born in areas quite distant from Teotihuacan, and then lived their adult lives in Teotihuacan, perhaps as soldiers in service to the state. Some of these individuals came from as far away as the Maya Highlands. This is a view of one of the necklaces. You can see it has a whole series of shell and coral false teeth. They are carved to represent human teeth, but then suspended below this collar were actual upper maxilla, upper jawbones of real human beings. And this would have been a difficult piece of the body to remove. The person needs to be beheaded, the lower jaw needs to be removed, and then the upper palate cut off. Wearing these pieces of the human body as a trophy of your triumphs in warfare, perhaps, would be a very impressive and intimidating piece of clothing to wear, indicating your status and your social position and power. And isotope ratio analysis has been used on some of these upper maxilla. Were these people who were from Teotihuacan, or were they distant enemies? And the results seem to show that there are both, that some of these were individuals who perhaps were dispatched because of their resistance to the state or some other infraction, while others may have been distant enemies whose bodies were mutilated and then used as trophies to indicate the triumph over these distant enemies. Adjacent to the Ciudadela to the south was a large, almost industrial area for the production of pottery. And one of the primary types of objects that were created there were these censers. These are composite pieces molded, put together in order to create a variety of different forms representing deities or ancestors. These were created in a centralized workshop and then likely distributed by the state during ritual activities, and they are found in almost every apartment compound and were the center of votive worship within these compounds. You can see how molds were used to create standardized repeated forms, particularly in the censer that's on the right hand. And these could be taken apart and combined together in some cases in order to have perhaps different versions of the deity for different times of the year and different rites that were being performed. These are called censers because they were used to burn incense. So in the right hand example, you can see the bottom actually opens up the container where incense would be placed, and smoke would drift upwards and through and perhaps emerging out of the face of the deity. You can also see that both of these individuals are wearing a particular facial ornament, a nose ornament, one that hangs suspended from a hole in the septum. These nose ornaments are commonly depicted on what may be deities and also what appear to be humans in costume, personifying deities. On the left is a design molded into the clay, and on the right is a design that was painted onto plaster that was put onto the clay after it was fired. This allowed certain colors that could not be created by firing the clay, like a greenish blue, to be used. These painted stuccoed vessels used the same sort of technology. It was used to create murals on walls, where a plaster was spread on the wall, and while it was still wet, it was painted, so the paint is actually within the plaster. The individuals depicted in various media usually have these nose ornaments, large ear ornaments, very elaborate costuming, including very large headdresses with many feathers and often representations of an eagle's head or face. Some researchers have labeled this depiction the Great Goddess, but other researchers have pointed out that there are no specific indications of gender, and in Mesoamerican art, gender is often very specifically indicated by various forms of clothing, and these sorts of cues are absent in depictions of this individual, who very well is a deity that is associated with fertility. It may be a human form of the feathered serpent, but you can see from the outstretched hands scrolls that indicate water pouring forth, and between these scrolls you can see seashells, indicating that water is being created by this deity. These nose ornaments are not just represented in art, but actual ornaments have been found, carved from stone and from shell. They have a very distinctive, stylized form that was intended to depict a real object, and these have been interpreted as representing the terminal segment of a rattlesnake's rattle. You can see an actual one at the end of that rattlesnake's rattle, and the artistic representation of one on the feathered serpent pyramid, and how they look remarkably similar to the nose ornaments. So they are a symbol of the rattlesnake, a symbol of the serpent that is worn on the face, where it could not be avoided and transmitted a lot of information in any sort of face-to-face interaction. In this reconstructed mural, we can see the deity at the center. While there is no human face, there is the raptor face. There is a human body, but from this human body emerges a tree above, indicating that this deity is the axis mundi, has this connection between the underworld, the upper world, and the earth world that humans live upon. Approaching this deity are humans that are wearing costumes that allow them to personify it. Look at how the headdresses the individuals on either side are wearing are identical to that the deity wears. These individuals, priests most likely, are holding sacred bags in one hand, and their other hand stretches forth, and from it reaches upwards a speech scroll that is used in Mesoamerican art to indicate speech, prayers, or songs that are being said by the person, and then pouring down from their hand the result of this speech act, this prayer, this song, is water coming forth, scrolls of water with seashells within, and plants beginning to bloom from it. So this is depicting offerings being made to the god. The god stretches his arms out, and water pours forth from it. As a result of their speech acts, their offerings, their prayers, their songs, the priests themselves have the potential to create moisture, to bring rains, to bring fertility upon the land. In addition to personifying the feathered serpent deity, there are murals and other depictions of individuals personifying that crocodilian deity. So you see the long snout, the teeth, the big googly eyes. We also see the sacred bag being carried in one hand, and the other hand stretching forth with speech scrolls going upwards, and water with flowers sprouting from it coming out. The nature of rulership at Teotihuacan is not well understood. There are no images of identified rulers at Teotihuacan. Among the contemporary Maya and the earlier Olmec and Epi-Olmec, there are representations of kings with glyphs that identify their names, the important acts in their lives. And there is this great emphasis on these individuals and their power. But we don't see this at all at Teotihuacan. What seems to be more important than the individuals are the ceremonial costumes that represent the specific roles that these individuals fill. And there seems to be a lot of emphasis on militarism, that many of these roles were associated with the expression of power through violence. Here we see two individuals in some sort of raptor costume with a feathered headdress and beaks above their faces. Their faces are standardized. It's not expressing any individual identity. What's important is the identity that is encoded by the costume. You can tell that they're people because there's raptor's feet from which project human feet wearing sandals. These individuals are enclosed by a feathered serpent who within its body has stars that represent the cycle of Venus, the morning and evening star, and footprints indicating travel. Warfare in much of Mesoamerica was timed to the cycles of Venus, and this seems to have been an innovation that was first developed at Teotihuacan, that later spread to the Maya and continued to be used by the later Aztec. These costumed individuals bear in one hand the sacred bags, and in the other an atlatl, a spear thrower, and pierced at the end of that spear thrower is a human heart that is bleeding. They are coming victorious from battle with the essence of the enemy, the power of the life of the enemy attached to their spear throwers. The current interpretation of rulership at Teotihuacan is that it was not consolidated in the hands of a single ruler. Rather, there was some type of collective governance by a council of military elites with certain supernaturally sanctified roles, and that their power was not just from military power, but also control of trade and commerce, an extension of the power of trade and commerce through their military power. And in the next section on the Maya, we'll see how the rulers of Teotihuacan extended their power into the Maya region, inserting themselves into successional disputes, choosing who they wanted to be the seated king at various Maya centers. So what to remember? Teotihuacan was the first large urban center of the Americas. It was the first true city with a densely settled core. Civic Ceremonial Center was surrounded by this dense habitation of apartment compounds, which is very different from earlier Olmec centers, where you had a civic ceremonial center that was surrounded by a dispersed population of rural peasant farmers. There's evidence of large-scale craft specialization at Teotihuacan, particularly industries related to the mining and production of obsidian tools. And in the video, Josh Bernstein visits and goes down into some of these prehistoric mines. There is also large-scale craft specialization in the production of pottery, particularly the censers that were used in religious rituals. The apartments were not occupied by individual families that paid rent to a landlord, but rather they were corporate groups of related people, people that were related through kinship, through marriage, through clientage and patronage. And these corporate groups were maintained over multiple generations. And these were groups that worked together economically and politically. Survey of the city has identified certain neighborhoods or barrios with distinctive architecture and artifacts that are in non-local styles, suggesting that they were occupied by immigrants. And you read about strontium isotope analysis that has been used to demonstrate the immigration to Teotihuacan from distant regions, like the Gulf Coast of Mexico and the modern state of Veracruz, and to the southeast in the highlands of Oaxaca. And this was demonstrated by comparing strontium ratios in the teeth, which are formed in childhood, versus the strontium ratios in the bones that would reflect the strontium ratio of the local environment of where the person had lived in the decade prior to their death. And if there are differences in the tooth and bone strontium ratios, it indicates movement during the person's lifetime. Unlike in the earlier Olmec or among the contemporary Maya, there are no individually identified rulers in the artworks of Teotihuacan. Rather, it has been suggested that there was some collective governance by a council of elites, and that is why there are more than one palatial structures along the Avenue of the Dead, more than one administrative building, because they are each associated with these different groups that contributed to this council of elites. Teotihuacan seems to have met a violent end that we do not fully understand. The destruction at the end seems to have been focused on the central part of the city, destroying the residences of the elites, the temples associated with them, the idols within these temples. Was it outside forces coming in and destroying Teotihuacan? Or was the selective nature of this destruction focused on elite residences and the temples used to support their power? Was it an uprising of the lower classes? We are not sure, and this is an ongoing avenue of investigation. It's something to listen for future developments and understanding the complex story of Teotihuacan, the first city of the Americas.